our next speaker, Dr. Alexander Ochem. He is a consultant at African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, and he'll be speaking to us on the role of African government and indigenous manufacturers in vaccine research and development. I'll read his bio very quickly. Dr. Alexander Ochem is an accomplished independent pharmaceutical manufacturing consultant. He's very passionate about promoting indigenous manufacture of diagnostics, vaccines, biogeneric pharmaceuticals, and other products needed for Africa to become self-sufficient in the production and supply of healthcare products to guarantee adequate supply in the case of any outbreak of diseases that threaten global health. Dr. Ochem has consulted for the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, AVMI, Cape Town, South Africa, the National Biotechnology Development Agency, NABDA, Abuja, Nigeria, the National Institute for Pharmaceutical Research and Development, NIPRD, Abuja, for various pharmaceutical companies in Europe, Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. He has lectured in several universities, including Covenant University, my alma mater, the Federal University of Agriculture in Abeokuta, the University of Jos, and alongside a lot of other universities. His lectures and presentations have always focused on the rational use of modern biotechnology to enhance healthcare delivery and improve health outcomes in African countries. Dr. Ochem holds a PhD in molecular genetics and biotechnology from the Open University London, United Kingdom, and an MSc in pharmaceutical chemistry from the University of Trieste, Italy, and a first degree in industrial chemistry also in Italy. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me as I welcome our next speaker, Dr. Alexander Ochem, on the role of African government and indigenous manufacturers in vaccine research and development. A round of applause for him, please. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for that introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I've been asked to talk about the role of governments and indigenous manufacturers in vaccine R&D and production. So when I got this invitation, I think it was way back in June, I couldn't lay hands on the chief host today because of his commitments, but I could lay my hands on the chief organizer. And I asked him, Dr. Dotu, why do you want me to talk about this? Why do you want me to talk about the role of governments? I said, you know pretty well who I am, that I do not do politically correct talking, but I talk facts to authority. So what do you want me to say? He said, no, I want you to come and talk. So when I came, and from the presentations of yesterday, it would appear that Africa leads the world in everything that is good. But I do know that less than 1% of the vaccines used in Africa is produced in Africa. And like, if anybody read my profile, I said that I'm very passionate about seeing that medications are produced in Africa. So I said, well, if you want me to talk about the role of governments, if you want me to talk about it, do you want me to talk the facts or do you want us to do window dressing? He said, no, we don't want to do window dressing. So, but when during the presentations of yesterday, I went to him, I went to the chief organizer and I said, no, I'm not going to talk today because from the progress of yesterday, it looked like we have everything right. Do we have everything right in this continent? when we have that less than 1% of the vaccines used, and the same thing as medications used in this continent, are produced in this continent. Do we have everything right? Please, can I have your answer? Okay, I was asked also to dwell on the role of governments. Who here represents governments in Africa? Can you show, please, by raising your hands? Nobody here represents the government. So who am I talking to? So it's the same question that when scientists get to talk, we talk to the converted, but we don't talk to the people who need to listen to us. So we're kind of running around in circles, saying the same thing all over and again, and I think it's foolhardy. I mean, if we're saying the same things and repeating the same things over and over and over again, and we expect different results, I think it will never happen. We will never get different results, but we'll continue to get the same results. The screens here are not working. Okay. So, why do we talk about, if we can have this screen so that I can see them. It's quite easy, quick, to enumerate the role, what we expect the governments to do. Education, capacity building, and the rest. So it's quite quick to run down the list and say this is what we expect of the governments. But we've been saying this for decades and decades, so the government know. So they do know what we expect them to do. I don't see that one, that is too tiny. But if we can have these ones on, it will be better. All right, thank you. So if they know this, it means that is not our problem. And like many people say, that if you don't know, well, the first thing is to say that the first step in the cure of any disease is to recognize that there is a disease. So the first step in solving a problem is to recognize that there is a problem. And we say also that if you don't know where the rain started beating you, you probably might not know where it started beating you. So we need to really understand what is going on, what is our problem. Since this might not be the problem, because they know, governments of African countries know what they're supposed to do to enhance R&D, health R&D. Let's not talk only about vaccines, because vaccines are preventive, but after that, then you have diagnostics, you have medications, you have therapy, and the rest of them. So you do know, okay, so they know what they're supposed to do. So if they don't do it, there must be other reasons. But before that, let's just look at our Africa, the continent we're talking about, Africa and the rest of the world. That Africa actually never really needed the rest of the world. But the rest of the world needed Africa, always needed Africa. Why? Because you see, as we have, all the continent is full of minerals everywhere, from petroleum to gold and all that. But then we ask, if that is so, if Africa has all the minerals, why is it still so poor? Why is Africa poor? And the reason is that it's only in Africa that the golden rule does not apply. Does everybody here know what the golden rule is? Can anybody tell me what is the golden rule? The golden rule is that who has the gold makes the rules. But in Africa, it doesn't follow that we have all those things. For example, we have so many oil-producing countries, yet the price of oil is set in Vienna, Austria. We have diamonds and all that, gold, platinum, and everything, but the prices are set somewhere else. So something must be the problem, and we need to identify where. Okay. So I come to what I call the wealth of the nation. Now, the wealth of a nation is the health of a nation is the wealth of that nation. Because the healthy people will generate produce and wealth, the sick will generate very little, and the dead will generate none. And as a corollary, I say that who controls your wealth also controls your health. Can we have these screens, because it's training me to look elsewhere. Is it possible?
Or do we move this?
Or we move this closer so that I can see it a little better.
I think he's signaling about 2 minutes more, right? Yes, he's trying to say in 2 minutes he'll get it right.
2 minutes, I'll get that. Yeah. Okay. So this is in 2006, I authored an article for the Nigerian medical practitioner. This is a journal of the University of Lagos. I was asked by the Vice Chancellor then to write about malaria vaccines. 2006, I authored that. I discussed so much about vaccinations and vaccines for malaria, the potentials. So the title was that malaria vaccines between hopes and fears. So I discussed everything so much about vaccines and the vaccinations and the potentials and why it would be difficult, if not impossible, to develop an effective vaccine for malaria. And 15 years down the line, I see that just a couple of weeks ago, I was able to read that there are some candidate vaccines that might be promising for malaria, but I still say that it's impossible to have that. And the reasons I detailed in that, because beginning from the high mutagenicity of the parasite, the malaria. But then again, I ask myself, why do we have to sit in Africa and the malaria vaccine, potential malaria vaccines are being studied and developed in the UK? It's not their problem, it is our problem. Because the malaria kills in Africa, not in the UK, not in Europe or the rest of the world. And by the way, since I mentioned the high mutagenicity of the malaria parasite, it is possible that what they are studying has no bearing to what is killing us here in Nigeria and in Africa. Yesterday, Dr. Owolabi spoke a lot about the deadly effects of cardiovascular diseases, but I still point that malaria is probably the highest killer in Africa. And in 2018, I was in a conference in Abuja on vaccines, malaria vaccines, and there was a guy who was studying there in Abuja, and he made a wonderful presentation studying the Plasmodium vivax. And after his presentation, I went up to him and I said, why do you spend all your time, all your effort studying Plasmodium vivax? It is quite far from the Plasmodium falciparum, which is deadly in Nigeria. Oh, but he said, yes, because I was being funded by an institute in India. Okay, so I said, okay, that's right. Who pays the piper often dictates the tune. So I said, now, all right, now you write up your PhD thesis, and then you get into working on Plasmodium falciparum, because this is what is relevant to us in Nigeria. So again, that is not, again, the problem. So we still need to identify what is our problem. So, like I said, that's not actually the problem. So why do I say that that's not our problem? And that our heads of state know pretty well what we expect them to do. Because if you just look at this, you see a number of failed promises, pledges made by the African Union, heads of state of African countries. And I have here a copy of the original of the Ajax Declaration. But what's most particular and interesting to me is the Abuja Declaration on rollback malaria of the year 2000. I happen to come from rural Nigeria, and there it was said that malaria infection will be detected and treated within 48 hours. And I asked myself, who knows in my rural Nigeria, in my rural village, who has malaria in Nigeria? It's impossible. Nobody knows that. And we're talking about detecting and treating malaria infection within 48 hours. So it's obvious that we're talking about things that we're not ready to realize. So we're just doing, again, window dressing. So I say, again, that is not a problem. So what is our problem? So if anybody read my the abstract I submitted for this meeting, I said, and I repeat, that is a deliberate lack of the political will. Deliberate lack of political will that is to give funding for research that is really keeping Africa and keeping R&D down. Please, can you, that's right, fast forward. All right. Thank you. Go ahead, go ahead. Okay, that's right, that's okay. So we see in 2001, so you see all these declarations, so it means that the African heads of African countries do know what they're supposed to do. So their failure to do it is not anymore coming to tell them you should do this, you should do that. But we'll look a little bit into details of what we want them to do. So again, what is the problem here? Okay, so we're beginning to find this is the problem because we say that if we realize, no, wait, please, no, you're going too fast now. Thank you, that's right. If you look at this picture, it's the Berlin Conference of 1885. So we start to really understand and appreciate and recognize the origin of the problem. If you look at that picture, there is no African there in this. So it is the outcome of this Berlin Conference that divided Africa into fictitious countries, which are very welcome now, that is really keeping Africa. Because now what we see is that, roll up, that if you want to make an African believe what you're saying, you must tell him that a white man said that, a European said that. Without any offense to the white people in here, but I'm talking about Europeans and the impact of the European colonization. Can we move forward, please? So, when I went to consult for the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, the first thing was that I saw a deck of slides, and they have arguments for and against vaccine manufacturing in Africa. You can just read that, okay, for vaccine manufacturing, security of quality supply of vaccine supplies, addressing Africa's unmet needs, the African specific needs for vaccines. But then on the right side are the arguments against vaccine manufacturing. And I said, no. But if you have exactly the same arguments for manufacturing and against manufacturing, then it means you're not serious. You cannot tell me that you have equal, the only difference there, the 7-1 partnerships and partnership opportunities, it's not really that important. So you don't have really any strong motives to move again for manufacturing. So I said, but can't we manufacture vaccines? Is it so impossible? Why do we have to depend on others to manufacture vaccines? And by the way, you make a study of vaccine manufacturing, the capacities, and who does this study for you? Not Africans themselves. Always people from outside come and tell us what we are and what we can do, and we take it. People have to tell us who we are, what we can do, and what we cannot do, and we take it. That is our problem. Mental slavery, mental emancipation. And people sang it, I think Bob Marley sang it several decades ago. Emancipation from mental slavery. That is what we are suffering. Can we move on, please? Okay. And why do we have this? If you just take a look at the National Institutes of Health in the United States, they spend $43 billion in health research in this year, 2021. Okay? And more than 80% of that goes to funding research to several universities and and scientists. And the same thing goes for other places. China is funding, okay? China is now top country when it comes to filing international patents. And their research funding, R&D, went from $40 billion in the year 2000 to $515 billion in research funding. So are you surprised if they have so many things, if they have breakthrough science? So they are number 2 in funding now. And I saw this from the president of the Nigerian Institute of Nigerian Union of Nigerian University Teachers. And he said that in all our universities, the facilities are not even comparable to what you find in secondary schools. And that is really true. Because when I before I left Nigeria for Europe, I think it was in 1973, I went to the University of Lagos. I went to the mechanical engineering department, to their lab, and they had engineered and built a vehicle that had double heads, 2 engines. So if you're driving in the forest and you meet an obstacle, you don't need to reverse. You just need to move to the other side and drive off. But when I went back to this same university, I think it was years after I've been away to Europe and I came back, what I saw was just a shame of what it used to be, completely run down. Okay, so he said that they agreed with, in the time of President Jonathan, that 200 billion needed to be disbursed to universities, to revamp universities annually. But as at the time he was writing, less than 30 billion had been disbursed. So if you study and you realize that you need 200 billion naira a year, and then you give less than 30 billion, what do you expect? You expect that things don't get done. And it was the same thing when I went to consult at the National Institute, at the National Biotechnology Development Agency. And I said, what do you have here? You have laboratories. Are these laboratories for biotechnology? I said, I'm a biotechnologist and I can help here. But what I have seen here are not biotechnology labs. They are not even anything worth of laboratories in secondary schools. And the director told me, well, we asked for so much money and less than 10% of it was given. And I said, well, there are 2 things you could do. Either you refuse that money because it wasn't worth anything doing, or you set up just 1 laboratory instead of spreading it over so many laboratories. I said, because all these need to be pulled down if you really want to practice biotechnology. And by the way, the second year I went there, they were organizing what we call Open Forum on Agricultural Biotechnology. And every year when people would come around and they say, we intend to do this, we intend to do this, we intend to do that. And I went up and I said, they said, that's our brother who has come here. He's always interested in coming here to tell us how we do things. And I said, no, I'm an observer this year. And he said, no, please come and tell us what you think. So I went up to this rostrum and I said, first thing is that I don't want to come back here every year and I keep hearing, we intend to do this, we intend to do that. As a biotechnologist, what I want to hear the second year is that when I come, people will tell me, I started doing this and I got stuck here. I got stuck here because I didn't know how else to proceed. And then I said, we will then brainstorm and find a way to go forward. But it's not every year we're thinking we're moving on, we're thinking we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And while other regions of the world had gone ahead in biotechnology, Nigeria was still thinking if we are going to do biotechnology or not. As we stand now, there is a biotechnology policy, but it's not implemented. So I said, how then? Okay, so he says, this is why we are where we are, because we don't have funding for our research. And how can we move forward if we don't have that? All right. Again, this slide shows the percentages of GDP of African countries globally, the GDP. And we see Nigeria spent 0.13% of GDP, where in 2007, because that was the most recent available. All the other spending has just not been reported. And we look at, so Nigeria is one of the least spending in GDPs spent in R&D. Whereas we see China, South Africa, has 0.73. China has 2.1% of GDP. European countries, average of 2.18. USA, 2.83. Japan, 3.28. South Korea, a country that's just that small, with just about 100 and something million people, really very small. But see how much they invest. So this takes me to when, I think it was in 2004 that I went to Ghana, and it was, the conference was titled Environmentally Friendly Technologies for Africa's Sustainable Development. When I came back to Lagos with the bag, I think one customs man was looking at it and he was laughing. He couldn't even read it. I said, yes, that's true. Because we designed big names, very important names, environmentally sustainable technologies for Africa's sustainable development. The Minister of Education in Ghana, the first day, made a wonderful presentation and said that we have Asian tigers and Indians and so much. Why don't we have African lions? So I went back that night and modified my presentation. And the following day after her speech, she was dismissed from office anyway because of her presentation. But then I projected and I said, Japan spends so much in biotechnology. Korea spends so much in biotechnology. England spends so much in biotechnology. If you give us 1/10 of what they spent, we will be African lions and we will really produce a lot. So with this sort of spending in R&D, we cannot do much, really. This is, again, a slide. This is a study we did in 2012. Many of you here may know of an initiative that was called the African Network for Drugs and Diagnostics Innovation. Does anybody know here? Andy? Anybody here? None about Andy? The African Network for Drugs and Diagnostics Innovation. Thank you very much there. This was the year I, myself, and a colleague led the Andy initiative. And Andy wanted to go from R&D, basic research, up to manufacturing. And we wrote a business plan, and we said that we were going to raise $300 million that will lead us to go from R&D to manufacturing. And we had centers of excellence. We called for centers of excellence, and we had so many of them. But when I went to Canvas to negotiate in one African country, the Minister for Health in that country, I don't want to mention names, said that it would be important for us to bring the $300 million to invest in her country. And I said, no, but we are going to raise this money from you and from other African countries. That we didn't have this money. So it boils down to the fact, if you just look at this graph, that external funding is much more. So we depend, so Andy and African countries want to do things, but we depend on external funding. How do we expect people outside Africa to fund research in Africa if we know that we want to do things and Africa wants to get free and then you want other people to fund it? It's impossible because it's absolutely inhuman. Because we know that in Africa, coming to sell their drugs and medications and everything is their business. And you want them to help you to develop and make your own. It's not possible. And that's why Andy failed. Because when we went to look for funding from European countries and the West in order to set up manufacturing in Africa, it's impossible. They wouldn't do that because nobody will want to. Nobody ever gives up an advantage he has over another person without a fight. Are you going to do that? You want me to come to you and you teach me and you fund me to overtake you? It's not possible. I hope I'm not overrunning my time. 2 minutes more. That's a little too little. So then it means I will have to be fast. So let's talk about this FDA, we all know FDA, the Federal Food and Drug Administration in the United States. You can read this through, but they started way back in 1882. So, but this is the amount of money they have for funding, and these are the type of people that work for them. Okay, but they started way back in 1882 with this man, Wigley, the guy in a cap there. Okay. In 1882, just as one person, one chemist in the Department of Agriculture, and then he grew gradually, and now there are more than 1,000 people. And for us in here, they review everything, they license and do everything. But in Africa, what we have, the AVRF for vaccines, and we have also the medication. But then who funds it? It boils down again that the funding comes from outside. AVRF is currently being funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and earlier funders were the EDCDP, European Union, again, Canada, and the rest of them. And how can this be? Like I said before, that, move this up, I have a corollary that he who pays the piper often dictates the tune and also the dance pattern. So this is what is happening to us. Are we ready to face it and to address it? And the African Union, let's take it up to the African Union. African Union is not funded by African countries. If you just read there, the majority of the funding of the African Union comes from the West. And how do we expect, if you read there, one of the programs, the program budget for African Union is to be funded 63% by donors. And this is to develop the master plan. And one of the plans of the African Union, Agenda 2063, do you know what's one of the components of Agenda 2063? That we want, the Africa we want, that Africa becomes a dominant, listen to the word, dominant player in the global arena. So, we want Africa to dominate the world by 2063. And who is going to fund this transformation to dominate the world, the rest of the world? We fund us. We fund African countries to get up, overtake them, and dominate them. Are we serious in ourselves? It looks we are not serious in ourselves. Can I have the next slide? Because now I'm running, I have to run. So I say, I hope this doesn't surprise anybody, that in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, it's called STEM, and in health research, there are no miracles. So those who flock to churches, mosques, and the rest of them, and praying God to transform Africa, it doesn't happen. Not that prayers are not important. Prayers are very important. I'm an ex-seminarian myself, so I was training to be a Catholic priest before I left. But there are no miracles. There are no shortcuts. There are no quick fixes. There is no leapfrogging. This is what every other developed countries want us to do. They tell us you can leapfrog. No, there is no leapfrogging in science and technology. Because if you don't understand the principles of algebra, you cannot understand differential equations. All right? So you can hurry up, run quick, but you cannot leapfrog. You can only leapfrog as a consumer. Now, in many African countries, there were no fixed telephones, and we jumped to mobile telephones. Yes, you can leapfrog, but only as a consumer, not as a producer. And if we want to produce, we have to do the talk and walk, do all the steps. If you count 1, you must count 2, 3, 4, 5. You can be quick. You cannot count 1 and 100. It's daydreaming. And there are no technology transfers. There is no technology transfer. We must get this down in our heads. Nobody is going to transfer technology to you because nobody will give up an advantage he has over another without a fight. So you want me to tell you how to make your clothes, the one that I come to say to you, so that you make it yourself? No, I will not teach you that. Because I watched a scene where a bird was taught to play piano with a beak. So it means that if you teach a bird, an animal, it can learn to play. So then we say several decades there have been talk about technology transfer, and we don't learn it, then it's either we are rocks, blocks, stones, or there is no really teaching. And this is what we need to understand by ourselves. So, and this brings me again to this, that there's no African there, and Africa is pinned to the table and being cut up in pieces. There can be a lot of motion, this continent trying to struggle to free itself. All motion but no movement. So we can be motion, make motions, but we're not moving forward. So these are some of the equipment, but I will be really quick about this. Some of the equipment that we would need to do research. These are cryopreservation systems, contains liquid nitrogen. This is a laminar flow hood. Okay, so we need liquid nitrogen to store cells at minus 184 degrees Celsius. This is nearly 0 Kelvin. And you cannot think about that when you don't have constant electricity, because any 5 minutes of lack of electricity heats up the system and you have to throw the whole thing away. This is another laminar flow hood for control where you have controlled sterile rooms where you count the number of particles. Like in this room, you have less than 1,000 particles there because you have HEPA filters. And this is a air treatment and filtration system that will guarantee the sterility of those places, workplaces, sterile places. Again, these are another air filtration system. But are all these things impossible? They are not impossible at all. Can we move forward, please? They are not impossible. But if you look at the composition of the gases that are emitted when in gas flaring in our oil-producing areas, you will see nitrogen there. You will see carbon dioxide there. So this is nitrogen that, if liquefied, we can use to preserve cells at minus 184 degrees. And you see carbon dioxide there, which we can use also to grow cells, transform cells. So these things are being wasted, and we still don't have. Now, let me talk about the indigenous manufacturers. I just chose a few samples of this, Pfizer, how Pfizer started in 1843 by two cousins. Okay, they didn't have two big structures, but perseverance there, moved them on. In my next slide, we'll see, okay, this is Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and the history of Johnson & Johnson. Okay, look, Johnson & Johnson, how they moved on. Okay, they were quick, but they started small. And I wanted to show another Moderna, one slide, please. Go ahead. The Moderna just started. So I chose two samples of institutions, industries that began many years ago, but this one that started only in 2010. So they have only one product they have, the vaccine, the COVID vaccine is their only product. So they were just a few years, 2010 they began. So encouraging, so by this I want to encourage local producers. But then it's foolhardy also for me to say that we encourage local producers if our governments are actively working against them, because the governments here in these countries, in our countries, actively work against local production by getting engaged in Gavi. Gavi, that promises them vaccines free, but the vaccines are actually not free. They're absolutely not free, and they actually cost a lot more than if you produce them internally. So there's something wrong. So I have now a 12-point agenda of what we want. No, go back a little, yes. What we want African governments to do. And unless and until we do these things, I think vaccine or production of medications in Africa will be a mirage. We just keep running around in circles. So the first thing I say is that you have to secure and guarantee the freedom of Africa. It's like an interview that was made to a famous writer, Chinua Achebe, many years ago. And he said, but actually, the independence you gave us is completely empty. So Africa is not free. So the first thing that African governments need to do is to secure and guarantee the freedom of Africa and desist from living in denial or in self-deceit. Renounce the long-lasting culture of dependency. This is one thing that is killing Africa, the dependency culture, attitude of our governments. Provide quality education right from the primary school. Because like I said, there is no leapfrogging. If you don't teach a baby well in the kindergarten, he will not do very well. But even if we forget kindergarten and we go to the elementary school, if you don't teach a baby well in elementary school, he will struggle a little more in secondary school. But if he struggles more, university and tertiary education will become prohibitive for him. So we need quality education right from the primary school. Then we need to recognize, this is another thing I kept saying, that Africans, we have capacity for everything in this continent. If you think about it, I know a friend of mine when we were running Andy that was sent by Novartis, and he went and set up the manufacturing in Shanghai. He's a Ghanaian. So we have, and then we think about many Africans that are working in important places in Europe and America and the rest of them. So we have capacity in this continent. The only thing is that, do we harness that capacity? We probably don't harness them. So we need to recognize and encourage self-confidence in Africans, implement pledged declarations. There's so many declarations that African countries make when they get together in Addis Ababa. They need to be implemented. Then we need to entice back the right-minded diasporans, African diaspora. China was built by diasporan Chinese. India was built by diasporan Indians. Diasporan Africans have the capacity. And if you entice them back and give them the right opportunity, the right environment, they will develop Africa just as much as they are doing developing other places. Encourage and sustain local manufacturing, provide necessary enabling environment, and curb current debilitating excessive xenophilia. What is made outside is always most interesting. So much so that in African countries, especially in Nigeria, there is the clothing that women use, and this clothing is made exclusively for them in Holland. And they say, this is Hollandese. And you make it in Aba, and they say, no, this is Aba made, it's not good. So when we talk about infrastructure, this is one of Enugu-Onitsha Road. I just found this, it was very interesting. Expressway is one of the busiest roads in Nigeria. But if we have somebody who's in Onitsha and wants to take something, either supplies from Onitsha to Enugu, and he gets up and he doesn't get to Enugu, well, he doesn't deliver that. So this is the type of infrastructure we have. All right, so I end with just the last slide I think I have here. Oh, I said by myself that if decades into independence, governments of African countries are still unable to think with their own heads and take their own private and uninfluenced decisions as leaders of independent sovereign nations, then I ask, why did African countries seek independence in the first place? Why did we seek independence in the first place? This is my last slide. It's the first genetically engineered product, medication, insulin. Is very cheap to produce. And there is an epidemic of diabetes, insulin-dependent diabetes across many African countries, and yet this is not made anywhere in Africa. The last place we tried to set up a manufacturing for insulin was in Egypt, and we did a company that makes insulin, Eli Lilly. They came and supplied insulin free for 3 years, killed the initiative, and then went back to recover their losses. I thank you all for your attention.
Hello. A resounding round of applause for Prof. Please don't leave the stage yet. Please. Can we